So I think that is very important, and of course it is a hard question. It made me think when you're answering of Bacon, what is truth? Asked jesting Pilate, and did not wait for an answer. So of course that's a terribly hard question to ask anyone. I will mention this, and I'd like to get your comment on it. I asked Lorraine Daston, and I asked Rainey the same question in the interview about the history of science. And she gave a related answer that she thought it was relevant. And then I said, well, why do you think scientists don't ignore it? And she said outright, and I was kind of like surprised, but also happy in a sense of to hear this answer. She said, because it doesn't give scientists the answer they want.
Yeah.
So what I think is, so this is, and this is something
I think,
yeah.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
Yeah, look, I think that's right. Essentially, it's not a scientific question, and it's not part of scientific formation, and it's not helpful for the kind of status of science and the image of science. So it's many. Okay, let me not reflect on the motivation of science. Let me just make a practical point here that I think part of the problem is that the university curriculum is so crowded, and that our educational system is so hyper-specialised that there simply isn't space in the scientific education for scientists to grapple with these kinds of questions. And as I said to you, I studied science as an undergraduate, and I was very fortunate. By the time I got to my third year, doing a subject called evolution, I was able to take an elective looking at evolution and ethics. And I was also fortunate being able to take 2 history of science options in the program, and I got quite interested in that. But I think for undergraduates now, it's actually, it'd be very difficult to be able to outside the sciences. So our system of science, the way in which we form scientists and our systems of scientific education actually militate against the kinds of, even the possibility that we've just discussed about scientists becoming more familiar with their history. Now, to go back to the question about the status of science, as you're right to say, we're kind of treading a very thin line here, because science skepticism is the other side of the story, and it's a major problem. People who don't accept the authority of science in the areas where science is the authority. And so to be on the sidelines asking questions about whether science gives us access to truth, we have to be clear that whether COVID-19 vaccines are effective, for example, or whether evolution is the best story we have about how we got to be here. That's not what we're about. But so it's quite tricky. And to go back to Rainey's answer to the question, scientists would, I think, understandably be concerned when they see what could be attacks from humanities people who in their view have no understanding of the sciences, and who are just off on some kind of weird relativistic trip. And I want to be clear, that's not what I'm about, and obviously that's not what this project is about. But there is, all of that said, there is a kind of something that's incipiently relativizing about studying the history of a discipline like this, because you just see over time how all of these changes take place. And that's entirely consistent with the view that science delivers us wonderful things and that it's a great enterprise. But as I say, studying how science actually works as a human enterprise, with fallible human actors, I think it gives you a very different view of what's going on. And I don't think it would hurt if we could somehow incorporate elements of that into the education of it. It would be helpful.
Right, as you suggest, and as others, have suggested, it might make, in a way, science, better. Like as you pointed out in physics, when I interviewed Avi Loeb, the astrophysicist at Harvard, he was extremely critical, just very directly critical of string theory. And so, I think when people outside of physics come to understand that the dominant position in the field that is held for over 40 years and has received, as Loeb points out, billions of dollars of funding, that many distinguished scientists think that it's not only false, but maybe not even science. I mean, this is where I think I would just say we have to, I think, trust people, which Loeb does. He trusts the public, I think, more than many scientists do, to understand, yeah, we can make distinctions. And McLeish said the same thing. We know when we have good evidence, we have much stronger evidence in some areas, and that's where science is, it's an authority, and we need to show people that. But at the same time, if you just tell people, well, science sort of is infallible, then any sort of actual inquiry into science's cultural context and history can actually produce science skepticism, almost as a sort of a reaction against what you could say is a sort of unconscious but quite dogmatically simplistic presentation. So it seems like what you're aiming for, and certainly what the project is aiming for, is to maybe a kind of maturity or complexity that enables more cooperation between natural scientists and historians and philosophers. At the same time, I think it's fair to say, and this is what I was trying to gesture at in the introduction, your work, in the field in particular, but your work is really quite revolutionary in the sense that if it's accepted, it will and should lead to new pictures of the past and new pictures of what it is that we're doing in the sciences. In particular, for example, maybe we could just touch on this one issue, because I think it'd be of great interest to people. We do take the current status of science for granted. And since we've laid out a bit of a foundation for why scientists might want to care about their history, we can now raise this question. It's not been the case that historically humans have thought, I'm going to do a bunch of experiments, assume that many of them won't work, and then have this long-term vision of just keeping on trying this until we get better answers. This is a radically peculiar thing to happen. And your work argues that actually this has a great deal to do with Christianity. So do you mind, if you don't think it's too off topic, maybe just giving people who are listening and watching a sense of where did experimental science come from? Like, why, if science is so successful, in a way, when people start to realize actually it comes out of this matrix, I think that can help put flesh on the issues that we're discussing. So in your view, Peter, and I know you wrote a whole book on it, why do we do experimental science? Why did experimental science get off the ground, roughly speaking, in the 17th century in the Western European world, and not have just been something that many other distinguished cultures of science in China and in the Arabic world, for example, didn't have this exact form?
Yeah, look, good question. I want to preface this by saying, as everything in history, these things are overdetermined. So there are lots of causal factors. But for me, the point is that the experimental science, and this is not just the performing of experiments, but a whole approach to the sciences we call experimental science, it's uniquely Western. And so the broad question is, we've got science in various forms going on all over the place, but only in the West do we get this distinctive version of science. And so obviously what this suggests is that there's something about the cultural matrix of the West that's given rise to this distinctive set of historical scientific practices. In order to provide some background, perhaps we should say that for Aristotle, who on any account was the most influential scientist or natural philosopher who ever was, because his approach to nature lasted 1,000 years, which is astonishing, really. This basic fundamental approach, it lasted 1,000 years. And arguably it still hasn't gone away, and it's coming back in various places. A whole other interesting story. But Aristotle's approach to nature was based on the fact that human minds are more or less attuned to how nature is. That's their goal, is to discover knowledge of nature. So we will naturally intuit what's going on in the world simply by observing under normal conditions. And Aristotle has a conception of nature that, as I said, it's what's happening out there. If you do something to nature, if you do something to it, what you're then observing is not natural at all. It's violent, he would say, or it's artificial. But the very idea that intervening in the natural world to discover things about it was completely paradoxical for Aristotle, because as soon as you change things, you're no longer studying nature. You're studying some set of conditions that you've artificially produced. And so what we need in the 17th century is for a complete radical reversal of that common sense view. Right, a common sense view that it's essentially, that's part of its success. So that by actually tinkering and changing nature, you can actually discover more about it. And that really lies at the heart of experimentalism. So now this is part of as you say, a book length story. Why would we think we should do that? Well, one reason is that the natural world is not actually in its natural condition, which is to say something's happened to nature that actually makes nature not obvious as a way in terms of its operations. It doesn't reveal its operations to us. They are under a veil. Nature loves to hide. It's a classic pre-Socratic quote, actually. So the Christian tradition of a fall gives us some account of why nature has changed, and the myth in Genesis is that Adam and Eve rebelled against God as a consequence of this. Their own cognitive capacities were limited. They were no longer the moral beings they once were, but crucially, no longer could they reliably intuit knowledge of the natural world. And at the same time, the natural world, we got wild animals and animals eating each other and so on. The plants didn't grow nicely. And so the natural world itself had changed. So human mind changed. And what this meant is that the Aristotelian assumption of a natural affinity between our minds and the world, that no longer held if you bought seriously into this Christian view of the fall of the human mind. And at the same time, the world had changed from its original pristine, transparent condition. So those two things together combine to suggest that if we want to know about nature, we can't just take it for granted that it's obvious and transparent. We've actually got to do some work on it because it's now hiding its truth from us. Moreover, we can't naturally intuit directly what's going on. We have to observe nature under specific conditions because our own minds are limited in what they can understand. So, an obvious example would be Aristotle's science is based on the idea that, common sense observation. So a feather, if we drop it, it takes a long time to reach the ground compared to a lead weight. Okay, that's what we observe, and we would normally build science around that. But if you put those in a vacuum, they accelerate uniformly at exactly the same rate. But in order to see that, we have to create this set of artificial conditions. And there's nothing in common sense Aristotelian science that would suggest that's the case. So that's part of the story. And there are a lot more aspects to it too. Crucially, I think, the idea that a single human mind could intuit what's going on now it's off the cards. And so what we need is a corporate enterprise where you have lots of people working away at tiny bits of large problems, and they need to do this for generations and generations. And in order for that to happen, you can't just have amateur philosophers out there looking at the natural world. You've actually got to somehow make this an industry. You've got to industrialize it. You've got to get, crucially, something like government support for this to happen. And so all of these notions, the idea of experimentation as interfering with nature, the idea of experimentation as to making nature reveal secrets that it's hiding, the notion of experimentation as a palliative for the limitations of human cognitions, along with making this a corporate enterprise and a cumulative enterprise, all of these are kind of answers to a problem that arises in the 16th and 17th centuries, because Christian thinkers are going back to a very strong version of the fall that they encounter, particularly in someone like Augustine, over against a medieval view that was much more sanguine about the prospects for human knowledge, partly because they were aligned with this Aristotelian approach. And so you get critiques of Aristotle by the Protestant reformers, for example, who say Aristotle knew nothing about the human fall. And had he been cognizant of that, he would have had a very different approach to the natural world. And I think that's exactly right. And that very different approach to the natural world, cutting a very long story short, is to some extent the product of taking seriously the limitations of human cognition and the putative fallenness of the human world. So that's the once over lightly version.
Yeah, and those who are interested in more, and I'm going to ask a follow-up, they can read The Fall of Man and the Foundations of Science. But I think this is so exciting. And so maybe I can summarize part of, what you're saying, and then in connection with the book, and particularly for people interested in philosophy, is this is even related to my own work. I've long thought that there's essentially what I would say a sort of Lutheran metaphysical tradition, which, there's very old Kant scholars in the beginning of the Kant Studien era who, I think one of them, I can't remember, maybe it's Atticus, wrote an article about it. But what you show, I think, very strongly from my view in the book, and what you've just said, is that what we think of today as critical epistemology or epistemic humility actually arises very specifically out of this exact framework you're describing. It is very unusual. It actually, but what you show is you need a sort of view of the world, like that the world is somehow damaged, occluded, hiding, that our own faculties are hurt. And the result is then you get this whole set of questions, which you show, of course, they can go in a Cartesian direction. People can answer them using, you could say, more traditional, optimistic resources. But the questions themselves are quite revolutionary, and they produce what we think of as this totally secular enterprise of early modern philosophy, but that I think you show the entire enterprise, whether it's Descartes or Locke or later Kant, of asking what actually is the power of the faculty that humans have to know anything. And that comes out of this assumption, which is connected to your prior book, and that there's really a kind of an irony that Christianity is not just Christianity. It's rather the revival of Augustine under the conditions also of literal readings of Scripture, which lead to a far more literal version, in a way, of the fall than arguably even the Church Fathers had, who were still very, very Platonic in a way that many of the reformers are not. And that then produces, in that cultural context, a deep-seated ongoing reflection on what is the actual power of human beings to know. And what you show in that is that early modern philosophy isn't just a story. And this is part of what I do think I just want to stress to people listening. It is revolutionary. The people who know the history of philosophy, the history of modern philosophy is supposedly about epistemology. But what you show very persuasively in your remarks and in the book is really, and good scholars I think have known this, you point out Dilthey has a remark to this effect, it's about anthropology, because the status of the human and the status of the human in nature itself are so overshadowed by the question of, like, how damaged are we? And so from something that people could interpret as this completely negative view of human nature, right? Because instead of the Enlightenment story of science comes out of this confidence in human reason, it's actually the opposite, that science comes out of this deep-seated anxiety almost about, can we know? And Bacon, of course, as you show, he's part of the Bacon, Hooke, many of the founders of the Royal Society. They're at the very forefront of this. They're very Protestant. They're very Augustinian. So I don't know if you maybe want to add more about the bigger picture that then this story changes about how we conceptualize the sort of emergence of science, not as a story of secular progress per se away from religion, but rather actually most of what we value, even as secular people, you could say being humble, reflecting on our limitations, this actually comes out of a profoundly religious engagement with a very literal reading, in a sense, of Scripture.
Yeah, so I think that a couple of key points there, that it's obviously resources within the Christian tradition, but it's only at this point in history that they are manifested in this particular kind of way. And so there must be a story about what's different and distinctive about this. And so Christianity obviously is not just the same thing over and over again, and we get different versions of it. And so the Protestant Reformation is a key part of this. And crucially, it's not just a kind of revolution in religious conceptions, but it's a revolution that changes the whole of Europe, and it changes its institutions and its universities and so on and so forth. And so institutional change is going to be a key part of that. But your point about the critical approach to epistemology, I think, is really key, because again, for the standard Aristotelian understanding of the human person, we are naturally, for Aristotle, that famous first line of the Metaphysics, that humans by nature, I've forgotten the exact.
All humans by nature desire to understand.
Desires, no, yeah. And for Aristotle, these desires will naturally be these desires are not, because nature does nothing in vain, the other classic Aristotelian maxim, these desires will not be frustrated. And so human beings are natural knowledge makers, and we have the whole package that's necessary. It's interesting that in Platonism you get a slightly different version, because the Platonic conception of Platonism not foreshadows, but there's a kind of parallel notion of a fall that you see in Plotinus, that insofar as we're material beings in a body, we have certain limitations. So there is a parallel conception there in Plato that I think is important. But so this conception of our limitations, then we do see it becomes an acute issue following the Protestant Reformation. And there are a range of solutions, including experimental natural philosophy, as you've said. But if you look closely at the philosophers, you will see it. Then it's clear to me in Locke, and Locke's famous essay concerning human understanding, that on the very frontispiece, there's a biblical quote about the limitations of human knowledge, and that's clearly what Locke is interested in. Descartes, if we're going to buy into this empiricist rationalist distinction, which I think is somewhat problematic, but the truth to that distinction is that for the Cartesian tradition, there's an attempt to appeal to the integrity of the natural light, which is the original capacities that God had invested in human beings in their original state in the creation. So there's actually a theological dispute about the extent of epistemic damage done as a consequence of the fall. And the Protestants take a strong Calvinistic Augustinian line that the whole of the human person has been corrupted as a consequence of the fall. But in the Catholic tradition, there's a slightly more optimistic take that says, no, insofar as human beings are rational animals, our rationality cannot have been vitiated by the fall. It must be to some extent intact. And so you get a tradition, and this is I think the truth of this distinction between empiricism and rationalism, where the latter is a little bit more optimistic about what can be salvaged in the human person after the fall. And this is why Descartes will consistently talk about appeals to the light of nature. And the light of nature for the medieval scholastics was the rationality that was preserved, one of the gifts, as it were, that was not taken away as a consequence of the fall. So different Christian anthropologies will yield slightly different epistemological approaches. And so the marriage of the experimental and the mathematical, I think, that we see in science is something of a cobbling together, an instance of the kind of anything goes principle, because the underlying anthropologies are not quite consistent with each other. But nonetheless, that's the kind of path you see, that your mathematical approaches, particularly to astronomy, and experimental approaches to the more complicated things. But again, if you look if you look carefully at the philosophers, and Malebranche is the one who I think is most conspicuous on, most explicit about how Augustinian anthropology is playing into his philosophy, and also helping us read Descartes in the light of that. And as I say, on the other side, you've got John Locke, who's very clear about human limitations, our present condition. Science is really the best we can do under these limited human conditions. But even then, the whole thing is very much a makeshift enterprise. But of course, eventually it becomes the only game in town, and then we forget these original modest assessments of what science consists in and what it can help us accomplish. And what it can't help us accomplish, and someone like Locke is very clear on this, is some notion of moral perfection. And really, the whole aim of philosophy up until this point, and science as natural philosophy as part of this, is about, it's not moral perfection, but moral formation. And so science is a kind of second best enterprise in that respect. But the interesting historical story is, I think, how people have taken the ball off kind of moral formation as the aim of the game, and now focused on practical utility, because that's actually where we can do clearly. We've cracked that problem. We have a method and a set of methods for cranking out practical utility. We haven't actually sorted out the moral question, and that kind of falls by the wayside, because it's like, to the person with the hammer, everything looks like a nail. We've got a terrific hammer in the methods of the sciences, and that tends to lead us to construct all of the problems in the world in terms of the solutions that we can have. Problems over here that we kind of, to some extent, ignored and left behind.
And in that sense, you could say maybe the morality has been left behind alongside with truth as a science, as a sort of, it's something that in a way, surprisingly, we want science to help us with, but and this is one of the things I think is really remarkable about your work, is that there's so many ironies, right? The story you're telling is in a way the historically more accurate origins of science ironizes and subverts the modern Enlightenment story that science culturally tells about itself. But it actually then renews an ability to, it's not like you're saying just because this is the case, we need to believe in religion, but rather, if you care about why science began in this way that's very distinctive, the experimental science as a whole approach, it is actually originating from a specifically Christian anthropology that is concerned with human sin, with human limitation, and that there's something I think quite salutary to that in a moment in which we're exactly culturally trying to navigate both defending the integrity of science and its utility, while also trying to have a better sense, as you suggested, of its limitations. And speaking of limitations, I'm aware of the limitations of time. I have so many more questions I'd like to ask you. Let me just, if you don't mind, I'll ask you just a sort of a short but hard one, because you've done this work. I think, Vittorio Hössler wrote a book called Wahrheit und Geschichte, Truth in History, his first book. And the first sentence is, the history of philosophy is the greatest challenge to philosophy. And sort of summing up a lot of our conversation, in one sense, it seems this is obviously true in a sense of science. At the same time, it seems like we could say the history of science is one of the great resources for science. And I think your work is a great resource for people who are interested in coming to, in a way, a just more culturally interesting, accurate view of science's power and its limitations. But insofar as the history of science maybe, and this would be a real irony, if the history of science maybe gives us some more access to truth than we might have thought historians can give us, would you agree, I'm going to put this as a claim, would you agree that the history of science in a way supports more, not that we don't say the other side is very valid or important, but it supports more the experimentalist critical program than the Cartesian rationalist program, in the sense that, right, from the time of Descartes all the way to Immanuel Kant, this tradition of philosophy really is aiming at eternally valid, certain truth. And if it isn't that, it's not science. It is not scientia, because their conception comes right out of Aristotle's Organon and really in a way out of Plato. But Plato, I think, knew maybe better than his student that we rarely are going to get this truth. But Descartes really thought, I'm restarting everything. And it just turns out the history itself says that program, as stimulating as it was, the search for absolute certainty, would you agree that in a sense, the history of science itself has shown that wasn't as productive as it was? It's really actually not quite right. History, in a sense, can weigh in now after 350 years on this debate and actually say, of course, we need the math. Of course, certainty inspired great epistemic sort of searches. But it turns out humans are just a lot more limited than maybe we thought in the early modern period. And knowledge is really, really hard, which Descartes would have admitted too. But I think Descartes' whole program fails, just as Kant does, if you take them on their own terms. If you could have persuaded them, there will be no certainty, because they were convinced this was essential. And it just turns out people like Bacon, Hooke, and others, they thought this isn't what we're going to get.
Yeah. No, so short answer, yes.
Okay.
Two things to say. What part of what we haven't told here is there's a kind of eschatological dimension to this as well, and the distinction between Augustine's seculum, which is the here and now, where we're just kind of muddling along, and a future state where we will have access to truth or the beatific vision or whatever. And so we can't tell any of this story without understanding the crucial importance of what's an original conception of the secular and an eschatological understanding of which is the mirror image, as it were, of our original created condition. So the fall, redemption, final culmination of all things is certainly at the origins of science a really important part of the story. So the epistemic ideal of truth is postponed to the next world, and it's kind of this kind of realized eschatology. Who speaks of the imminent, making the eschaton imminent?
Yeah.
That's is at Berglund, you know, and that really is the kind of progressive story of science, where we bring that future state from Christian eschatology and we attempt to accomplish that in the present. And to some extent, I think you're right to say that sits on the kind of the rational side of the equation. I mean, one very quick modification. There's a very interesting book by Robert Pasnow on essentially on the Aristotelian epistemic ideals, and what he suggests is that Aristotle was actually less optimistic even than we tend to give him credit for, and that the conceptions of scientia and certainty and demonstrable certainty that he sets up as the markers for science were only ever to be understood as ideals, as opposed to things that could be actually realised in practice. So I just throw that in as another interesting part of the whole story about our epistemic limitations. But to come back to our main theme, you know, the remarkable successes of science, I think, have tended to, which ironically, as you've said, are premised on this very modest anthropology, actually occlude that. And they tend to make us think that science is going to solve all the problems. And in the present, that overconfidence in science is just as dangerous as the science skepticism, because people think science is going to solve, say, the climate crisis, when I don't think it will.
Right. This is remarkable. Peter, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm going to. If everyone listening, I think, is going to have my reaction, which is what you ended with. They're going to think, boy, I want more of that. So maybe you don't have to agree to it, but maybe we'd love to maybe have a follow-up conversation sometime where we could pursue this conversation and maybe put it into this broader eschatological context. But either way, I want to thank you so much for your extraordinary work in this really thrilling and enlightening conversation. I'm so grateful for your time and for everything that you're doing to help us appreciate the value of science and its really rich and extraordinary connection to history, philosophy, and religion.
Well, thanks, Sam. A real pleasure to speak with you today.